So 10:04 is the moment in Back to the Future where lightning strikes the clock tower, which allows Michael J. Fox, who's traveled back in time to get back to the future, to return to his present, which was the present of my youth, the mid-1980s. But 10:04 is also the moment in Christian Marclay's video collage, The Clock, which is made out, of clips from a kind of whole history of cinema. 10:04 is also the minute 10:04. That scene from Back to the Future is also the minute 10:04 and the Marclay collage. So a lot of this book is concerned with the way our notion of the past or future determines the texture of our present. So I liked the idea of both evoking time in the title, but evoking time, both time, kind of lived time, and the time of art, and those distinct temporalities and how they interact, and also the way that the narrator kind of re-experiences this fragment of a fiction from his youth, Back to the Future, in this new form in the present when he sees the Marclay video collage, and how even though it's the same image, it has a totally different resonance for him the second time he encounters it. So I just thought that the title kind of gathered some of the book's concern with different orders of temporality, and also its concern with the kind of the relationship between fiction and the real. So much of this book is about the way that fact gets transposed into fiction, and that fictions then have real effects, that I wanted to blur the boundary between the historical author, me, and the narrative and the fiction, precisely because that's a kind of live thematic issue in the book. But also there's something funny kind of happening in this book where part of I think 10:04 is about this narrator kind of learning to empty himself out to become a vehicle for other people's stories, which he links to kind of the Walt Whitman's project of being a kind of making himself into literature where he can be a kind of transpersonal space for different people. So, for example, the narrator, like 10:04, the narrator is obviously important to 10:04, but much of the action of the book has to do with him hearing other people's stories or being kind of taken over by other people's stories. So there is an auto-fictive element, but there's also a kind of emptying out of the self so that the novel can be a space for other people's narratives. But both novels that I've written confuse the boundary between the kind of protagonist and me, not because I'm very interesting even to myself, but because the first novel is kind of about the fine line between fraudulence and authenticity, and the second novel is kind of about this fact-fiction divide, and in each instance I felt like blurring the boundary between author and protagonist was a way of activating those questions within the book. I think of the books as a kind of diptych, but I think of the narrator of 10:04 as kind of the author of Leaving the Atocha Station, but not really me, if that makes sense. Yeah. Like, so that there's these weird correspondences, there's this weird kind of distance between me and each narrator, and then the narrator of 10:04 in certain ways corresponds to the narrator of Leaving the Atocha Station, and in other ways does not. But this first book, which is very concerned with kind of solipsism, like being so involved in your own social management and dissimulation that you can't really even see other people. And 10:04 is more concerned with the possibilities of collective feeling. And so there is a kind of way in which the narrator of 10:04 is engaged in a much more outward-looking project than the narrator of Leaving the Atocha Station. But they are very much linked. Yeah. And I think that, again, because, kind of in the way of like Fellini's 8.5. I mean, not to say that the books are as good as Fellini's movies or anything, but in that way where, you know, I'm very interested in how, you know, the books you write become facts, and then they have consequences that feed back into your fiction. And that kind of feedback loop between the imaginative and the real is interesting to me. And not just in a literary way, but generally, you know, like what are the collective fictions that we tell ourselves as a society that have real effects, and then how do historical circumstances change those fictions, and what's exciting or terrifying about revisions in the narratives that we use to make sense of our lives, right? So like again and again in this book, there are people who have encountered some kind of collapse or change in the story they've been telling themselves about their lives. Like the woman Noor, who has this kind of identity really based upon being of Lebanese descent, who realizes her father isn't her father. And then there's this kind of question about the degree to which that nullifies her connection to that political struggle, or the degree to which it doesn't change it at all. You know, so this idea of the notion that we live by fictions, but those fictions are shaky and subject to revision, but that those fictions have real effects, is kind of on every level of the book and their construction. And it's also a relationship between the books as well. I think that that for me, in the composition of a novel formally, omission is really important. Yeah. Like what you leave out is really important, both in terms of the kind of rhythm and sense of aesthetic structure, but also in the sense of leaving space for a reader to have to imaginatively construct what you know, that the more gaps you have, the tactical gaps in a novel are spaces for readerly participation, where you invite a reader to collaborate in the construction of meaning. And novels that kind of pretend to give you all the information, to me, are very pacifying and facile in a certain sense. So there's that, and also, I mean, you know, I think that and maybe this has to do with kind of being a poet first, like I tend to think of novels as constructed as much by aesthetic patterning as by plot, having to do with motifs and rhythm, and so it's both, it's fragmented, even though I hope the fragments produce a kind of whole, but I don't want the false totality of a novel that pretends to just give you all the information.